Okay, hi everyone. My name is Julie Cosmano. Welcome to Past Business Intelligence Virtual Chapter, the March edition. Firstly, I'd like to thank Pragmatic Works for sponsoring our session today. And at the end of the session, there will be a survey that I will post. So please fill it in because I will draw a prize giveaway or draw a winner for a prize giveaway today. And I think it would be an ebook. So if you could please fill in the survey and provide a feedback, that would be awesome. So we've got a couple of announcements from the PAS headquarters, and the first one is that we do have PAS Business Analytics Conference, and that's happening on April 20th to 22nd, which is ideal for business analysts or data analysts. Pretty much if you're in the analytics kind of area, this might be the one for you. And our virtual chapter would like to offer $150 off registration to you by, if you're registering, you can use the BA VCPI code. And this code is only available for people who are registering for new registration. So if you haven't registered yet, you can use this code. We do have a number of virtual chapters on our PAS community. So if you haven't joined the other virtual chapters, I do encourage you to check them out on sqlpass.org/VC. There are also a number of other virtual chapter meetings happening. So if you get a chance, please do join them, because they're actually offered in various different sort of time zones. So in case if they're not suitable for you, you can also probably check out their session recording, just like this one. This session is being recorded. And there are also a number of SQL Saturdays around the globe, including the one that I'll be attending and speaking at, which is the SQL Saturday Brisbane on March 28th, also Huntington Beach on April 11th. So I might see you there in person. If you're keen to help out the PAS community or SQL Server community, we do have a website for you to join in, which is volunteer.sqlpass.org. We always appreciate a helping hand, so please take a look and join our volunteering team. And if you'd like to stay involved, please go to sqlpass.org, and we do also have our own BI virtual chapter website, which is bi.sqlpass.org. And as I've mentioned before, this session is being recorded just like the other sessions, and you can check all the session recordings, and we do have over 40 hours of this now, and it's on youtube.com/user/PASBIVC. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Steve Hughes, who is an architect at Pragmatic Works, and he'll be talking about implementing SSAS in Azure. So I'll just change the presenter shortly, and if you have any questions, please go to the questions panel, should be on your right hand side, and just type them up, and then I will read them as I go along or as Steve presents. Okay, so the presenter mode is changed over to you, Steve.
All right. Just quick sound check again. Make sure everybody can hear me and see the screen.
Yes, the screen's good.
Are we good to go? Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
All right. So as Julie mentioned, I am an architect with Pragmatic Works. I build stuff. My focus has been over the past number of years in BI and work particularly with SSAS and working in a variety of scenarios, working with the SSAS platform, in particular multidimensional, as we move along. For those of you who know of me, Data on Wheels is how you can follow me on Twitter. I'll be honest, I don't tweet a whole lot. You'll find my blog at Data on Wheels. I'm probably more active there than I am on the Twitter account all the time. So feel free to reach out to me in either of those venues, and I'll be happy to follow up. So today we're talking about implementing SSAS in Azure. The focus of today's session is first of all putting us in perspective of what's available in Azure to support us in implementing SSAS. So if you know, or if you've looked at Azure and you're like, well, where in the world do I put SSAS? We can see SQL database. We can see a lot of other tools. There's this Power BI thing that's coming out and all these pieces. But where is analysis services fit into the cloud puzzle? Well, right now it fits into VMs, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about. We're going to focus on the IaaS and VM infrastructures that we can look at, and some of the ways we can take advantage of what Azure has to offer, and while we implement SSAS in our own businesses and environments. We'll also look at the complications of connecting to an SSAS instance, and then we'll talk about some processing, scheduling, and load balancing in other scenarios. The goal here is focused on how to take advantage of components within Azure and what those components are and how you could leverage those to either build out a full-blown cloud structure for your SSAS or a hybrid solution, what that means and what the implications are of doing hybrid and so on. We'll also, I don't have it on the agenda, but we'll also at the end have a look at some of the pricing structures to give you some perspective on what that means. And as Julie said, feel free to fire questions. I think it'll be going into the message system, and Julie will let me know as we cover these off. So for those of you new to Azure, IaaS, infrastructure as a service, basically is about virtual machines. And this is where we host and we build out a virtual machine. It's no different than realistically than a virtual network that you may already have and VMs you're already possibly working with. So the overall concept and instruction is roughly the same. The only difference is that the hosting infrastructure for those VMs is in Azure as opposed to on-premise or in a different cloud service provider. Virtual machines are virtual machines, and we're not looking at physical structures. One differentiator I wanted to make on the difference between this and platform as a service. Platform as a service means I don't have to care about the OS and a lot of the underlying infrastructure and changes that could happen, including patching and so on. That is, I actually have to take care of patching and infrastructure as a service. Platform as a service is all baked into what we pay for. Platform as a service for SQL database is currently available, but it is not, we don't have that service offering for the analytics area at this point. So I hope someday we see something along that line, but at this point Microsoft's made no announcements or said anything about it, so here's hoping, right? I really believe that platform as a service is a great option for most of us. As soon as it comes available, it'll be awesome. But where we are today, and any of the SQL Server suite of products, I had to put other acronyms up there because I figured I didn't have enough on here, so I did the SSXS piece in there. So we all know the pieces that come in SQL Server. There's a huge platform. We'll be talking about really focus on SSAS, but we will bring up SSIS a little bit as well. So let's kick this off. The way that I've structured this, we're going to look through, build out to more details around the topics at hand. So when you start working with Azure and IaaS, you really, in our world, we're going to be focused on virtual machines primarily and what that looks like. So as you start to lay that out, one of the advantages of hosting in Azure is a pay-as-you-go type of model, which means that you can do, you can set up the most expensive model and components and only, pay a premium for it only for an hour or two if that's what you need it for. So as you're looking at building out an infrastructure to support you for SSAS, you have to keep in mind what's the purpose of the platform, what is the purpose of the solution you're putting out there. If you're using it for development, it'll change how you actually look at licensing and the VMs that you would choose. QA, UAT, same thing. You're going to do specific, structures that make sense for what you're trying to accomplish. Production environments, obviously we all know that we got to keep environments up and running. What does that mean? How does that lay out? We'll look at that as well. Licensing. One of the things to keep in mind when we get into the licensing section a little bit later here is that if you have an enterprise agreement or some other type of agreement with Microsoft, that it can both provide Azure credits as well as discounted actual licensing, and you may be sitting on a number of licenses that you can leverage. If that's the case for you, then some of the advantages we talk about from a pricing standpoint may not be beneficial to you, but it's something to consider. Here's my favorite thing. I love talking with guys on my team, guys like Jason Stray, who's really knows all these VMs so well. He's like, well, we're really excited. The G series is out. I go, great. So we're going to talk about what these series mean and what the letters mean, as well as what's basic versus standard, and what you should look at as you build out your environment. So first of all, and we're going to walk through a build out at the end of part of this session so you can actually see this in progress. It's discussing these pieces becomes an integral part of what we're doing, so you know what's actually happening as we make choices and build out. So templates. Microsoft has produced a number of templates we can use to actually decrease the time it takes to build out the solution. What I really like about templates is that they include the licensing for the servers. So if you build out, in which we're going to do, we're going to actually build out a enterprise 2014 platform, and when we do that, we're going to use a template. And what that means is that the licensing is baked into the cost of the VM. The bad part is if you own a bunch of licenses of SQL Server Enterprise, you may not want to do that. You may actually want to go and create your own VM and then install that, just like I was talking about in the next section there. So, because what happens is there's pros and cons. If you're sitting on a bunch of licenses, the advantage is to build a VM and then install your own media and use your own license. However, if you don't have that, you can take advantage of the licensing that's baked in. And you keep in mind, I mean, if you're going to use tabular models, you're going to have to do enterprise anyway. So you already know you're starting at enterprise price point. You can go to a standard for multidimensional, but at the same time, you got to weigh out the advantages of either one based on the environment which you're working in. Now, what it means is you have elastic licensing. When Microsoft introduced a product called Elastic Scale, or a service called Elastic Scale for a SQL database, kind of made it hard to talk about Elastic Scale, that terms, because they mean something different. So Elastic Scale is a product and service offering that Microsoft has. But what I want to really talk about in this scenario is the fact that you can actually leverage your investments in a service-based manner. So you can actually license what you use. So as you were building out a solution, as we get down later, we talk about load balancing solutions, and if you build out a load balance solution and your concern is, I have to stand up another server to help us out for an impacted load, maybe the type of service you run, you really need 4 or 5 load balance servers to handle your users at the end of the month through the, like the end of the month to the beginning of the month. But throughout the rest of the month, you only need like 1 or 2 servers. Well, if you pay for the hardware, and it's not just like anything else, and if you go out and buy your licensing, you eat those costs in that scenario. Where in this scenario, you actually would be able to shut all that down, and you wouldn't pay for the licensing or the hardware or the usage time while you're not using it. You bring them back online, add them to the load balancer to make them available as your needs grow. So. But like I said, it depends on what you already own and how those pieces lay out. Now, if you have MSDNs, you should have, if you have MSDN licenses, you should have some Azure dollars you get for monthly spend. There's a couple things to be aware of. If you have not actually worked with the MSDN license and your Azure environment, first of all, you should. It's a great place to begin to understand what Azure has available to you, and a great place to just kind of play with VMs or play with the other services that are available. Beyond that, MSDN doesn't includes your licensing costs for SQL Server. So when you set up an environment that's running that license, it's actually a reduced cost for both all the licensing involved, including the OS license and the actual product license, which are baked into that cost, get removed on MSDN. So the reason that that is important is that you want to make sure that if you're using MSDN, you can use that for dev and QA as it's designed to be done in Azure as well. And basically, you're paying for the cost of keeping a virtual machine running, but not really the cost of the OS or the product license, reducing your cost substantially for those types of environments. We talked a little bit about sizing, letters, and basic or standard. So this is where we get into what does Azure actually have to offer? As we I'm going to skip ahead here and talk about performance considerations and jump back to what we were just on. When we start talking about why we care about the size of the VM, we are looking at things like IOPS. If you've ever heard in the years gone by Denny Lee talk about you need more IOPS, it needs to be random read, and we need to support this. This is a huge deal on multi-dimension. You notice I don't even bring it up in tabular because obviously it's all in memory, but those IOPS matter. And how do we get that type of performance? And one of the biggest concerns in the early days of Azure and even up until about a year ago was the fact that how do we get the read performance we're going to need for a solution like analysis services where it will actually work to our benefit. And we're going to show you some of the options we have available on that. When we look at memory, we're obviously concerned about caching on both platforms or both models. So we're going to be looking at what's the caching model look like. How much memory am I going to need? What's that mean? For tabular, if you're new to tabular, I wanted to point this out that you can size your data, but you should always plan for 2 to 3 times the size of your data to handle the querying of the data as well. So when you start looking at tabular, if you, for instance, have a 10 gigabyte tabular model that you're working with, you're going to want to plan for a 30 gigabyte memory footprint. So and then you add the OS on top of that, and because we all are data folks and we never believe that any number is good enough, we'll buffer it some more. That gives you what kind of your target is you're looking for. What does my memory size need to look at for tabular? The processors come into play primarily from querying perspective, doing all the calculations and how parallel it can be, because as you add users, how many queries are pounding the system will determine the number of threads that can be handled. If you're familiar with formula engine versus the formula engine versus storage engine, formula engine is single-threaded for query. So as you add more users, you end up with more single-threaded requests. The more processing space you have, the more cores you have, the better off you are. You have more load that you can handle. And those are the things to keep in mind. So we're going to look at, I'm going to go back up now, and we're going to look at the sizing and talk through some of these pieces. So first of all, if you're talking about doing this seriously at all, you will not use BASIC because it's realistically too small. It's just not set up for what we're doing. Now, if you want to just do a quick prototype and you're paying for this on your own dime, look at BASIC, throw it on there. You'll get warnings. It'll say, hey, the size isn't big enough. You shouldn't do this on a shared processor with shared memory. Not a good idea. They're right, it's not a good idea, but IOPS are low, all that stuff. So just understand what you're using if you decide to use BASIC. But as we start to look at something you might put into production, we can go from A series through G series, and each series each tier has service, has things that we can take advantage of. So if we look at the A series first, I've got the A3 and the A11. So we've got a large, and then you have an extra large. So if you look across the board, A pretty much scales up as you go along. It starts out at A0 and it goes up to A12, I think it is. And each time you're adding CPUs and you're adding memory. The max disk size in the VM stays the same. It's 127 gigabytes. Basically, that's your operating system and your all the rest of the components like SQL Server install, those kind of things. Those all sit on your VM on the OS drive. There's a temp drive. It's labeled D in the VMs. This is where the reason it's temporary is when you shut the VM down, anything in that drive will be disposed of. It doesn't get stored or saved permanently. So on a restart, that will go away. So keep that in mind, because if there is some type of patching sequence or something you do which will force a restart, it will flush that data. So that's not you need to keep that in mind when you're looking at storage options. Max data disks. This is, as we talk through, we start talking about IOPS, right? So IOPS are based on the number of disks you can support and the IOPS factor per disk, which you see in the max IOPS column. So you can get 30,000 IOPS across those disks in A3, and I didn't do the math in my head, so 60,000 across an A11 with 16 disks in it. You're paying for the storage on the disk. These are pretty standard speeds. There's not the 500 IOPS is pretty standard speed. We go into the D series, and what you see there is a temp drive switches over primarily to SSD, and you start out with more memory, or you have more memory on a D12. But your IOPS stay the same. So if you're using if you'll have a lot of sorting and those kind of things going on, which even then, hopefully you're not swamping the disk too much in the case of even your analysis services queries, but if you are, you may find some advantages to go on the D12. Where it starts getting interesting are the next two. DS12, the S is for, it's not superior storage, it's, yeah, well, they have expanded storage capability, which is what this is focused on. So you can see the D12 and DS12, same CPU, same memory. Where we start to differentiate is the amount of guaranteed cache on the disk that you have. So 8 data disks, you get 144 gigabytes of cache. And the IOPS that are guaranteed as well as bandwidth. Now, one thing to be aware of is that when Microsoft builds this stuff out, they build out to an SLA, and they give you a guaranteed level of service. And the numbers I'm showing here are the max. But this is the idea behind this is that you will actually get a certain, you should get a certain level of service when you're doing this. And if your service drops below a certain level, Microsoft pays you back or gives you credit back for the service being online. So as you start to look at it from a production standpoint, what am I looking at? That DS12 is very promising because it is using SSD as for its temp space, but it's also distributing across multiple disks and giving us the ability to get up to 12,800 IOPS guaranteed. So we start to really see some, and the DS series is basically about the high-speed storage and its capacity and its ability to do the reads we're talking about. G5 is recently released, and this one here, you can see that the G series, we are at 32 CPUs, 448 gig of RAM. Now we're talking tabular type support. So if you think of the DS series is probably the premier level of support for an SSAS multidimensional instance, whereas the G5, the G series starts to help us out because it's increased memory, and all the disk is local SSD. So even though you can put 64 data disks on it, you may not need to because you're really focused more on the non-temporary SSD storage there that you can use at 6 terabytes. Should be more than enough to actually save your files down unless you're pushing beyond the, well, you really can't push the database size beyond the limit of memory, so you can see that there's some ability there to be had. You can also think of if you wanted to do 64 disks and you think about how we would normally do a SAN or those type of things, it would happen that way. You would do something similar to that G5 series. You could do that as well for multidimensional, with a focus being on the greater distribution and getting your IOPS out of that. So depending on how we all know, I'm going to give you the classic consulting answer right now. What's the best one? It depends. You're going to balance cost for performance. The advantage of Azure, and especially in the models that we're talking about, is that you can upgrade and you can downgrade as you need to. So there's some elasticity there that allows you to take advantage of better performance when it's needed and drop down when it's not. Now, I caution you to make sure you pay attention to the tiers and the series that you're on, because in some cases how it goes up and down changes based on what grouping you're in, about what it's capable of doing in that scenario. All right, so we're going to create an instance demo. We're not going to create the demo. We're going to create an instance, and it'll be a demo. And I did include, just so you all are aware, I do have the screenshots of what we'll go through for future reference.
Steve, while we're looking at the spinning up this Azure VM, we do have a question here. Can you use a Dev SQL Server license on Azure VM?
Yes, you can. You would have to install it yourself because that's essentially the equivalent of an MSDN license in that scenario.
Right. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yep. All right. So there are two ways to get to Azure's portal or management environment. So this is their new, they say preview. It's been around a long time, and it reminds me of Google previews, actually. It's been previewed for a while. They don't have everything in it yet, but it's a more elegant solution, which is the one we'll use. But just so you're aware, we can also do a very similar process just from the old management window. And you can see here we can just add new virtual machines and so on. All right, well, I will caution you, we will not actually complete the creation because two reasons. One is that It takes about 30 to 40 minutes for the server to come online as it's installing everything. But I want to walk through all the pieces. So this is our new portal that we can work with, and basically you go down and click New. First thing to be aware of is, if you're like me, we're going to go right to Data and Storage and go, wait a minute, this is not data and storage, because you have to keep in mind SQL database here is not a SQL Server database. It is an Azure SQL database, which is the platform as a service option. Compute is where all the VMs are stored, and so you can see here this number of VM templates already built out for you. Yes, you can do Oracle as well. A variety of different options are here. We're focused on SQL 2014. Now, the one that shows up right here for us is the one that is Enterprise on Windows Server. It has kind of everything on it for us. They do have optimized versions, which I'll show you. So if we go out to virtual machines here, we will see. Now these are, just so you know, if you're listening to a Microsoft demo, these are actually called blades that they're calling across here. So as we go to the SQL Server blade, you can see here that we have a variety of options even for, oops, let's go on 2014 here. So 2014 Web on Windows, Standard, Enterprise Optimized for transactional workloads, Enterprise Optimized for data warehousing workloads, and just straight up Enterprise. Now these are optimized for relational database data warehousing workloads. So if you want to port your entire data warehouse up there, it is a viable option, especially given if you looked at some of the sizes we were talking about. It's actually a viable option, but not the topic for today. So I'm going to close these blades out and go back to the beginning. And we're just going to pick this one here. This includes everything on the stack. And you can see here that we got a couple of options around creating the VM. And these gets into the pieces that we were talking about before. So I suppose I can shut it up. Well, so I give it a host name. In this case, we're going to call it pass BIVC demo 1. Hopefully no one else has used that name. Give it a username and a password. Now we get to the first choice we have to make is our pricing tier. What it does out of the gate, it makes a basic assumption that you're going to want to be in kind of this A-level beginning series. So you can see right here that we have A3, A4, and A9 all available to us. Now that gives us 8 cores, 112 gig RAM. So this goes back to what are we doing? Are we creating a tabular model? Then we're going to really be focused on how much RAM we're going to be able to get. Are we looking at the ability to put multidimensional out there, then how many data disks do I get, what's my IOPS? All that's laid out for you here. You can also see it online, and if you go to Azure's help, you can find out all these things. So these are the recommended starting points. Now, these are big numbers. This is important to understand, and we'll talk through why these numbers are so large. Keep in mind you are paying for an enterprise license which is charged by core. So as you look at these numbers reflect the VM size itself plus the equivalent, the enterprise license for SQL Server times the number of cores that you have. And at the end, we'll look at the pricing and show how this actually does make sense. Now, these are the ones they throw up as recommended. And we can actually pick View All, and it'll give us a few more options. So you can see we have an A0. So you can start out pretty lightweight, a quarter of a core. We all know that nothing will work at these levels, but you can do it. But you can also switch down and you can have a look at some of the other larger ones. So like an 8-core, 56 gig RAM, that might be about perfect for what you're trying to do. The ability to go 16 disks and so on. All these support load balancing, which is out of the gate, which is awesome. Then we have the D1 options, which are higher memory usually, with local SSD for temporary storage. So that means if you're dealing with some of that, you want to be there. We keep going and we get down to basic, and you can see here the basic prices are pretty low, but our IOP count goes down by 300. So I want to show you all that. Now you also notice that I don't have the DS options available. I also don't believe I have G available to me either. These are because in order to actually take advantage of these, I need to sign up for premium storage, which has its own pricing involved. So you can see that even like this DS2 here with 6400 max, IaaS, 4 data disks, auto scaling is available. So some really cool options that are available to you in these environments. You just need to make sure you understand that you have to have a certain level of service from Azure to take advantage of them. So we're going to go back to our recommended one. Let's see here. We're going to pull up A3. So I'm going to do a test scenario. My databases are pretty small. We should be okay here. So I'll pick this. Then we get into optional configuration. You basically will have to pick where you're going to store this at. So fire this up. A couple of things you have to do beforehand is you're going to need to actually set up well, we're not doing availability, my bad. You will need a network, and right now it's creating this virtual network for me. What I really want to do is I have one created. I would recommend you create a virtual network and you use that network primarily because it gives you the advantage of being able to start sharing stuff across domains and that kind of thing. So we just say OK here. So I pick that. I also will create a new storage account. Storage accounts where all your disks are going to be stored. So in my case, I actually have storage sitting out here as well. So I'm going to grab my storage account because I want to take advantage of an existing storage account, not create a new one. And then so here's a few. Oh, yes, we know. You can set up diagnostics, which will keep track of things. So if you're looking at wanting to keep track of your performance, it'll do all that work for you. Endpoints, if you know what you're going to want to actually have as additional endpoints, like SQL Server and SSAS, multidimensional and tabular, have ports that you can put on here as endpoints. You may want to just wait until it's done. Very easy to add after the fact. So, but that gives you some of the basic. You can actually do automatic patching for SQL Server, which means when a patch comes through, it'll do it. You just have to be aware of the schedules, and you can actually, well, they do backups for SQL Server, but I don't know if they do. I honestly don't think they do the backups for analysis services in this scenario. All right, so we say OK to what we have changed. Resource group is just a logical grouping of what you're working with. So in my case, I will once again grab a group that I have. So my subscription's already set for me. My location is in Northern Europe. Not sure why I'm in Northern Europe, but that looks like where it wants to set me up. So at this point, I hit create, and then we get to wait for about 30 minutes. Since we're not going to listen to it or make that happen or watch it happen, we're just not going to worry about that right now. So once it's created, you'll have a VM like this one here. This is one I created originally, so I'm going to let that one just go. And this is what you'll get. So it shows a working machine for me, where the DNS name is at. There should be a little bit of monitoring in my VM here. Shows the amount of usage I have in this blade. I don't have application monitoring turned on because I'm not planning to use it. Here's my data going in and out. I actually downloaded the Adventure Works databases to try to get them running. This gives me my pricing tier. At this point, that doesn't have an estimate on how much I'm spending because it hasn't been able to build that pattern yet because it's created fairly recently. But this gives you kind of an idea, so we can actually, now this is where it gets interesting. I can actually change my pricing tier. So I can go out here and say, hey, I would like to do something different, and it will actually put me in a different pricing tier, saving us money or costing money depending on what I need to do. So that's something. This is one of those advantages of Azure that makes it a lot easier. You can say, well, I need some more power. I know what I'm lacking in. I can change my tier and move forward. All right. So that's the extent of creating this. It's not really that hard to get it out there. The rest of the components that we talk about are a little more difficult because they're conceptual and there's pieces that you have to put together, and we'll talk through those pieces here. So let me get back to the presentation. Let's see. So as I said, this, the one I'm creating right now, I'll let it create and then I'll make it go away. You saw the pricing structure in the A3 instances. If I leave them running, I'm pretty sure that my boss will not be happy with me because it's about $1,800 a month. But that, be aware of where you are, and that's where MSDNs really come into play, and the ability to turn them off and deallocate them and save the VHD for later. All that, you can turn them right back on and go back to using them. Those are things to keep in mind for use as you go forward. We talked a little about networking and resource groups and storage. If you have been actively using Azure, then use what you have unless you don't want it on the same network or you don't want to share the storage space for some reason, storage account, and so on. If you've not created any of those things, if this is a completely new build-out for you, you can add all those things in the process we just went through. That template will help you by adding a virtual network, by adding a resource group, and by adding a storage account. That will all be done because those are things all needed by SQL Server in order to operate in that pattern. So that's the basics of getting yourself set up. So let's talk through, now you've got the service out there. What are some of the things that you're going to have to deal with since you're now on an Azure platform? Well, first of all, connecting a cube. As I'm sure any of you who have worked in any type of cube or any type of setting like that, you are fully aware of the fact that it requires Windows authentication. And for years, we've all asked Microsoft, can you please allow us another authentication type? Well, this is one of those scenarios where that actually hurts us and will cause us some grief. If you are working with a corporate domain and you're able to, and I've worked with customers where using Azure is a normal part of their practice, so they actually have the Azure environment as a part of their domain structure, and you can work to get the VM set up that way. Then federating your domain with Azure and working through site-to-site protocols and those type of things, that's the best enterprise solution. Regardless of what your plan is going forward, if you put this in production, you're absolutely going to want to look at an option like this, because this is going to allow people to, from their desktops, on site, wherever they are, they log into they're logged into your domain, and like anything else, I want to interact with the cube with Excel, I want to do some ad hoc analysis. This will allow them to do that because Azure becomes a part of the network. It's just a VM that's attached. It's from that point forward, it's all very much the same. Now, in non-production scenarios, that's less required. You can actually RDP to the VM, use Manager Studio there, install Office there if you need to. If you're working with an Office 365 account, you can browse your Office 365 account and use that licensing to help you with this. So you have other options if you're not really in a production scenario. Now, but it still doesn't really help you in UAT and those kind of things. The other option is to create an Azure domain in these scenarios and use Azure AD so you log in, authenticate, so you might have an entry point where people come in. And the classic would be is if you actually set up the SharePoint template, use that, create a SharePoint. So now you have SharePoint and analysis services all in your domain with the domain controller, and people can log in to a site and they're interacting with the data using SharePoint or some other tooling around that, and they're able to do that interaction. But all that happens in Azure, so you're basically keeping everything in the cloud at that point. So one of the key pieces that you need to be aware of in this scenario is that, like everything around the cube, the hardest part is getting your authentication to cross domains if you need to, and then understanding the implications of federating your domain. So as you start to think about using or implementing Azure, SSAS in Azure, you need to deal with this issue. This will probably be the most likely roadblock to actually putting a production use case in place, is if you don't already federate, what does that mean to your infrastructure team and the people you'll be working with to get there? That being said, I'm going to go back to, if you're working in a dev environment and you want to prototype and do a lot of work with analysis services and reduce, not have to request resources, this is an ideal place. So, like I said, it just depends on your use case in that scenario. Processing the cube. So, as you look at, that's one of those things you have to consider, because now we have analysis services in the cloud. Chances are you haven't migrated your entire data warehouse or all the data sources to the cloud. So all your resources are on-premise. Now you have to deal with the network bandwidth issue and other things around that. If you really plan to take advantage of it, you should consider looking at ExpressRoute. ExpressRoute is an Azure capability that gives you guaranteed connectivity and throughput. So that matters because you want to be able to process your cubes safely. Another option that has been brought up and I've seen used is where you actually process the cube on-premise using an on-premise instance, and then you use basically it's all file copy to copy it up to the cloud. Just do a file copy up to the cloud and do your update that way. So those are things, something to keep in mind. Can you get the bandwidth you need when you're processing your cube? How do you reduce the amount of data? The nice part is data on the way in doesn't cost anything. I don't know, in ExpressRoute that changes a little bit, but overall, your egress cost is mainly on the way out. So getting data into the cube is less of a concern than getting it out and on-premise. Azure sources, if you're there, you move your warehouse to the cloud, then you're in a good candidate to take advantage of just putting in your virtual network in Azure and working from that consideration. Now, Tabular. Tabular is a different animal in the fact that it's a mashup. As my daughter contributed, she mashed up a whole bunch of emoticons there. It's one of those things where it depends where your data is sourced from. It may be coming from the Azure Marketplace. It could be coming from from the Census Bureau. It could come from on-premise. It could come from off-premise. It could come from your Azure instance. It could come from an Amazon source. It doesn't matter. So when you're actually refreshing data in Tabular, you're going to have to take, obviously watch all your network bandwidth. You may find things processed faster in the cloud because it's not going through your network for all the extras that you're going with. So some people may have taken advantage of that. But at the same time, you may find that pulling data from on-prem into that is now slowing down some of your other processes. So just keep in mind, this is when you're processing, now you're looking at moving data to the cloud. It's like anything, once you move that direction, tools like ExpressRoute help with that because they do things to help with your bandwidth and help alleviate these issues. So I encourage you to look at that, especially if you're looking to do this and actually process in the cloud. This is one of the things you want to be aware of. Scheduling processing. So you can also, the obvious way to schedule your processing is using SSAS on an Azure VM. When you actually use a template, you get all the features, so it has analysis services, database, SSAS, everything's installed. You may turn some of the services off as you move along, and then you can always snapshot the VMs if you need to. The other thing to keep in mind is you can, like anything, processing has a different set of requirements from the amount of resources required to successfully process. Well, now you can set up a VM that maybe comes on at 1 o'clock in the morning. So it goes, picks up the data, processes the cube, and shuts off at 4 in the morning. Because once it's synchronized, you don't need that one anymore. So now you're paying for only the time it's actually on and working. Something to keep in mind is a true cost savings as you move along. Using the Azure Scheduler service is also available. This is an interesting concept. This is still, they may have just, I'm not sure if this just got released or it's still in preview, but it uses HTTP endpoints. But you'll need to create jobs that can be scheduled. So using C# or Java, you can use HTTP, HTTPS, and it actually uses a storage service too, but that doesn't really help us for what we're talking about. So you essentially need to be able to create an app that can receive an HTTP type call or REST call and says, hey, when I get this, initiate my job. The cool part here is that this is a service that's outside of the context of our VMs and will run, and it's really it truly is a scheduler service. Its entire job is to execute these jobs. It is in a fire and forget kind of mode, so it doesn't really, it goes and says, okay, you're going to be done whenever you're done, and you have to do logging and tracking some of that on your own. So it really depends on what you're more comfortable with and what you want to try. The advantage here is that if you are in a scenario and you've actually taken full advantage of Azure and you happen to have the ability to switch which processing server is, so if your processing VM goes down for some reason, the scheduler service, you can set up the job to actually switch that for you and keep on going. So it's not like the because the VM went down, the job won't run. So something to keep in mind. That's taking advantage of those services like that. Here's an example of a setup. Basically, you got to create a job. You'll notice I said add code here to call service in the job action screen, and then you can define the schedule. It's lightweight, but its capabilities are only limited by your imagination and ability to use the API, to be honest. Let's see our quick time check here. So we're coming into some of the more complex scenarios. When I started thinking about how I would take advantage of Azure and SSAS, this is the first thing I thought of. And I started talking and working with people like, how can we take advantage of load balancing and scalability in the cloud? So if you're familiar with the operations guide for SSAS, it goes through a load balancing scenario using a network of load balancers. So I grabbed the picture from there and posted it on here just to give you reference. Ideally, you should be able to take advantage of Azure to not only take advantage of the load balancing capability it has built in, but also take advantage of the fact that the VMs that you have online can be up or down depending on the level of service you need at any given time. And the load balancer will work in conjunction with which services are up and not. So if you think about in a load balancing scenario, so if we look at what we're talking about here, three query instances will be optimized for servicing queries. The load balancer can handle the sticky sessions is what you really need, so the queries are running so that you take advantage of the cache in each query server, basically following those things in the guide. So as you start doing that work, you can have things like, well, during the day from 10 to 4, we run 2 query instances because we just don't have the traffic to justify the third. We can turn the third one on for the high traffic period in the morning and late day. I can shut them all the way down to 1 overnight because realistically there's only 1 overnight, which is fine. And then when processing's done, I can switch which one's available. So I can make a copy and turn one on, turn one off, turn one on, turn one off, and so on, making my copies out there. Processing's done, shut down the processing server. The way to take advantage of Azure is to really understand what it means to be able to turn services on and off and use what you want. Because not only if you decide that this is exactly what I want, we're just leave them running, when you need to expand capacity, the same is true. I can add instance D, E, and F to expand my capacity and add it to the load balancing pool and all that stuff as a virtual thing, make copies, and we're good to go. So those are some of the things to keep in mind. There's 2 load balancing options available. Traffic Manager is a little bit newer and a little more sophisticated. Load Balancer is a straight-up load balancer that works just like you're seeing in the diagram. Obviously, you want to look at both options to see what makes the most sense for your platform and your needs. We've talked through a number of the scenarios already. Development when you need it, UAT and QA when they're needed. Because we're talking about what you can turn on, turn off. UAT and QA may not even need to be on overnight, so you may pay for 12 hours of time in both those instances as opposed to 24 hours. You can also do just a single server, everything on their option, great for dev. 2 servers, load balance like we showed, and then mixing the premises where things are based on what you have. So all those scenarios are supported in Azure. A lot of it has to do with what pieces you're able to turn on and how you can connect back off premise. So we can't go into Azure without explaining cost. So if you've never played around with the calculator, the big orange bar on the screenshot says they got a new one, which only has part of the stuff on there. But what's really key here is to understand that you can do VMs with licenses and without, and then what the extra costs are. There are always a few extra costs to keep in mind. So we're going to look at a calculator session I did, because I want to talk through kind of some of the things that are available. So when you do a SQL Server VM, you can see on the left side, I have a D-series VM set up. We're actually got 3 of them, which would be a typical load balance scenario. They all are 1 core, 3.5 gig of RAM, so they're kind of underpowered for what we need. Maybe they're great for querying, and that's about $3,700 a month, or $4.97 an hour. Something to keep in mind: you are charged. I think it's charged down to the minute. I'd have to double check that, but I know it's not an hour that you get charged for. So you get charged for a much smaller increment. And you see also down there I have an A3 targeted out there with 4 cores, 7 gig of RAM at $1,383 a month. Now, that $1,383, I also have that extrapolated up at the top one here, where we have an 8-core, 14 gig of RAM, 2 servers, $5,000 a month, plus a storage space I need at $500 a month. That's 9 terabytes of storage that I'm going to be paying for. So a total of about $6,000 a month I would pay, plus some egress costs, which really are not that large at the end of the day. So let's just boost our number maybe to $7,000 a month. But just looking at the $6,000 price. Now, this is no Microsoft discounting. If you have enterprise agreements with Microsoft, there are obviously you talk to Microsoft about what you can do, what the pricing looks like. These are estimates. So this is exactly what it is. It's an estimated cost. I bring it up because I want to talk about what that looks like in terms of the difference. If you're like me, you look at $6,000 a month and go, that's an awful lot of money. Then you open up the licensing for SQL Server 2014 Enterprise. The per core cost, just the open price, is $14,000 per core, which means that to get a 16 or an 8-core, to do 8 cores is $228,000. So that's 38 months at that current service price, 3 years. Life of typical hardware that we usually work in, our world of working in lifetime of a hardware. That $228,000 does not include your hardware cost, implementation costs, OS licensing, and so on. The $6,000 a month does. So, you know, you get 38 months roughly for the price, and it becomes the biggest problem is how you expense it in your organization. But I bring this up because it's always one of those things when you're doing the numbers and you're playing with them to start with, you're like, wow, that's a lot. But the reality is it's not as much as you think, and it could actually be a huge cost savings for your companies as you start to move and push things out that direction. Because now you can take advantage of things like if it's not on all the time, if it is on all the time, if, you know, what if I needed 3 of those servers? I got 2 up there now. What if I need another server? Well, that's another $100,000 in licensing plus hardware. Or I can boost this up by a little bit and move on. So that's kind of one of those things I really wanted to bring up and talk about in pricing because it does matter. And that's one of the reasons to take advantage of SQL Azure, or sorry, taking advantage of SQL Server analysis services in Azure and any other platform and getting this in place because it matters. It will save you money on the long run and give you more flexibility in how you grow your solutions. So the resources, I will make this slide deck available. I believe I'll give it to Julie. You can search for these. There's links underneath them, obviously, but if you search for them, these are some of the patterns that I was using to help guide how we would actually frame up a viable solutions using Azure. If you've been doing analysis servers for any length of time, you're familiar with the performance guide and the operations guide. You also are aware that they haven't made significant changes to the underlying architecture, so those documents are still valid, even though I believe they targeted 2008. Tuning for tabular models targeted 2012, as well as hardware sizing and a tabular solution. And of course, Microsoft Azure documentation is a great place to go, just to keep, and dig into the additional pieces that are there and look at the other options that you have. That's what I have. There's my blog. You can also reach me at steve@dataonwheels.com is my email address associated to that. I don't have my Pragmatic Works email up there, but you can reach me on the steve@dataonwheels.com as well. Thank you so much. I hope that I don't know if there's any other questions, but I hope you got what you wanted and learned a little bit about implementing this. Look forward to blog posts from me, because now that I've gotten through the session, I realize there's some serious gaps in what we really need to understand clearly in using SSAS. So I'll be highlighting some of those in my blogs over the next few months.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Steve, for that insightful presentation. Really appreciate it. And as you said before, this is actually not much documentation around, implementing SSAS on Azure. So we definitely look forward to your blog post. Yeah, and this session is recorded, so I will be posting the recording on YouTube. And let's have a look at if there are any other questions. Yeah, so we do have a comment here that someone on the audience has been looking at Azure for SSAS Tabular for playing with the Power BI dashboards. Have you had that experience at all, Steve?
No, I haven't actually pointed the new Power BI dashboards at Tabular. So which Power BI? I have to ask, which Power BI are you looking at? Are you looking at Power BI Designer, the new preview, or the existing Office 365 offering?
I think this is looking at the new one.
Okay, so the new one will work. There's good documentation around how to connect. There is a blog post from, let me see if I can.
I believe this is using the analysis services connector. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm going to throw this just in front so everybody can see it real quick. So this blog post, setting up a BI demo for Power BI Analysis Services Connector, that is been referenced by some of our guys internally as well as a way to get the connector working properly with an Azure hosted SSAS instance. So that's a great resource to go to. It's the one I'm hoping to leverage as I'm doing exactly what you just talked about, which is Power BI Designer against analysis services. So.
Okay, fantastic. I haven't seen that before, so thank you for pointing that out. I'll definitely have to have a read after this. Great, so we're just up to the hour. So once again, thank you so much, Steve, for presenting today, and thanks everyone for attending the session. Don't forget to fill in the survey because we will draw a prize giveaway after this session. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks everyone.